In this episode, we'll take a look at the Shure MV7 podcasting microphone. In this entire episode, you're hearing the MV7. I am recording with it using USB out to my computer and recording into Adobe Audition, just so you can hear what it sounds like when it's used in USB mode. Also, we haven't done any sort of processing with this audio, just normalized it to minus 23 LUFS. Now, I think it's really important to explain why. I've had complaints in some of my other microphone reviews. Why does it not sound that great? Why is it not very loud? The reason we're doing this is we want you to hear what it sounds like directly out of a recording. No processing whatsoever. Now, of course, we could do noise reduction. We could do some compression and make it sound a little beefier, and we could make it louder and do all sorts of things. We could EQ it. But as a microphone review, I want you to be able to hear what it sounds like directly in the recording. Now, a few things about this microphone. First of all, I think it's really, really convenient for podcasting, for online meetings, and anywhere where you need to record in a very simple fashion, where you don't have an audio interface necessarily, but you might want to upgrade to one later on. That's the idea with the MV7. Now, a lot of people are thinking, well, is it like a Shure SM7B, the legendary broadcast and podcasting microphone? And it sounds pretty similar. We'll have some samples here in just a second, so you can hear the difference between them, and they're not exactly the same, but it does sound fairly similar.
It was easier to know it than to explain why I know it. If you were asked to prove that 2 and 2 made 4, you might find some difficulty, and yet you are quite sure of the fact. It was easier to know it than to explain why I know it. If you were asked to prove that 2 and 2 made 4, you might find some difficulty, and yet you are quite sure of the fact.
It was easier to know it than to explain why I know it. If you were asked to prove that 2 and 2 made 4, you might find some difficulty, and yet you are quite sure of the fact. It was easier to know it than to explain why I know it. If you were asked to prove that 2 and 2 made 4, you might find some difficulty, and yet you are quite sure of the fact.
It was easier to know it than to explain why I know it. If you were asked to prove that 2 and 2 made 4, you might find some difficulty, and yet you are quite sure of the fact. It was easier to know it than to explain why I know it. If you were asked to prove that 2 and 2 made 4, you might find some difficulty, and yet you are quite sure of the fact.
Now, this is a dynamic microphone. From my point of view, this is very good for online meetings and podcasting because a lot of times we're doing those types of things in 2020 in our homes where we don't have any sort of special acoustical treatment in the rooms where we're recording. We're generally in smaller rooms. We're generally sitting at our computer with a big reflective screen right in front of us, so the sound will go out. It'll reflect off the screen and come back into the microphone. And frankly, that doesn't sound very good. It'll do the same thing on our walls. Hit our walls, reflect back, come into the microphone, and we'll get that reverberant sort of echoey sound. Not a great sound. The wonderful thing about a dynamic microphone in those circumstances is that it will not pick up a lot of that reflected sound, and it does a very good job of rejecting. In fact, we're going to show you what this sounds like as we turn it away and how much of our voice it'll pick up. So let me just do this here. I'm going to pick it up right on top of it, but here's an example. I'm talking directly into the microphone, and now I'm going to turn it. Now it is 90 degrees off axis, so I'm talking into the side of the microphone, and now I'm going to turn it around entirely, and now I'm talking into the back of the microphone at 180 degrees. We'll go ahead and keep turning around. Here's the other side. Again, 90 degrees off axis. And now we're turning it back around, and I'm speaking directly into the microphone. I'm approximately 4 inches to 5 inches away from the front of the microphone. So as you can see, this microphone is not going to pick up a lot of that reflected sound and any sort of other noise you might have in your room, computer fans, heating, air conditioning, things like that. That's why I think this is really good for those online meetings, because you're not going to get a lot of the noise. You're not going to get the kids screaming in the background as much as you would with a condenser microphone. Another thing that makes this microphone very convenient is, again, the USB output. It is a USB micro port, and we will come back and talk about that in a little bit more detail later. But what this means is you can use this directly into your Mac, your PC, or even your mobile device. It comes with 2 different cables, which makes it very easy to connect to your computer regardless of your computer. One is a USB micro output here to USB-A, that's the big USB connector, or it has another cable that is USB micro to USB-C. So if you have a newer computer with a USB-C port on it, you can plug directly into that. So comes with all that, really great. There's a headphone jack on the back of the MV7 that is 3.5 millimeters. You could plug your earbuds that came with your phone into that, or you could go with higher end headphones as well. I did test a set of studio headphones, the Bear Dynamic DT880 Pros, which are rated at 250 ohms, and it was able to drive those with no problem. So the short version of that, if you don't know what any of that means, is that you can use basically almost any headphones that have a 3.5 millimeter connector. Now, part of the reason that these microphones are so popular amongst podcasters is that they have a very broadcasty sound to them. I think it's a great sound. I think it works great for online meetings, for example, as well. So it's a great sound, and I think it works with most voices as well. A couple of things that are really pretty nice about the microphone here. You can control the input level or gain by just pressing the control here. And I just kind of move my hand along. Here's setting the gain higher. Here's setting the gain lower, so you can hear what that sounds like. Set it back up to where it needs to be. You can just keep rolling on there. You can also set your headphone volume. Just tap there, and same thing here. Just change it just like that. Now, you can also mute the microphone, which is really helpful. And now I'm unmuted again. So it does make a little bit of it's a pretty mild pop, but there's a little bit of a pop there, if you may have heard that, at least in my headphones. We'll see if that comes out on the recording as well. But that makes it pretty convenient. I think the mute in particular is really helpful if you're on meetings a lot. It is such a pain. You can be kind of, have to unmute yourself, and you're kind of searching around to find the unmute button on there. If you just do it here instead and leave yourself unmuted on the conferencing app or whatever you're using, this makes it a lot easier. Just tap right there and you're ready to go again. Another thing that's really nice about the microphone is that if you don't know a lot about audio, the app, which runs on a computer, both Mac and PC, is really easy to use. You can also use an app on mobile devices as well. It gives you some really simple settings. So for example, if you have no idea what a compressor is or what a limiter is or other things like that, you can do a variety of settings here, which are super simple. In the auto level mode, what you can do is just tell it whether you're going to be really close to the microphone or perhaps a little farther away from the microphone, and it automatically adjusts itself for your position. So it's constantly monitoring, and it will change the overall input level and things like that. So that's one thing it can do. You also have this tone setting here. So if I want more of a dark tone, if I have a very bright voice with a lot of articulation, perhaps a lot of sibilance where you get the sizzling sound when you say the letters S or C, dark might be a better setting for you. Natural is just sort of the default setting, and I think it sounds pretty good. And there's also a bright setting. So if you are really into that crispy sound, or maybe you have a darker voice without a lot of sibilance in it, the bright mode may be a better fit there. In my case, I'd probably stick with natural for my voice, or maybe even the dark setting, and we're back on the dark setting here. And then when I set it to near, it expects me to work up a little bit closer on the microphone. So those are really nice settings. Now, if you want to set things manually, if you're more the type of person that likes to be in control, you know a little bit more about audio, you have some great settings here as well. Of course, you can set the microphone gain yourself. You get up to 36 dB of gain. You can adjust what is called the monitor mix. And so, for example, in this case, if you are on a conference call of some sort, a Zoom call, something along that lines, you get an opportunity to decide how much of your direct microphone you're hearing and how much of the people on the other end of the call you can hear. You can do a mix. Generally, I'd leave that in the middle, and that'll get you the ability to hear yourself to make sure that they can hear you, but also to hear them as well. Or if you just want to hear them, that's fine too. You also get some very basic EQ settings. Right now I have it set to flat, meaning there's really no EQ applied or equalization applied. And EQ, for those that aren't familiar with it, is just a way to kind of sculpt the sound a little bit. The next setting is a high-pass filter. We now have that turned on. A high-pass filter is basically to kind of cut out some of the low-frequency sound. And the reason you might want to do that is if you have some sort of rumbling sound in your room, or perhaps an air conditioner running. This will help kind of reduce some of that sound a little bit. So the directionality of the microphone helps with that, of course, as we demonstrated already, but using a high-pass filter can help just a little bit more. Next up, we have a presence boost. So again, if you have one of those dark voices without a lot of articulation or sibilance, this can make your voice a little crispier. Or you can apply both a high-pass and a presence boost at the same time. So you can really kind of tune it to your particular voice. Use whichever one sounds best to you. Next up, we have a limiter. And what a limiter is supposed to do, for those not familiar with it, is that if you suddenly get a little bit louder than expected, in digital audio, you can get distortion. That's called clipping. And a limiter is supposed to prevent that clipping. Unfortunately, this one appears to be a digital limiter, and it doesn't always work. Let's give you an example here. All right, I'm right up on the microphone here, just checking to see how this limiter does in terms of preventing clipping. Technically, it appears to be preventing it from going all the way to 0 dB full scale, but it is right up against the -1 mark, and I wonder if we're getting any sort of distortion. So let's see what we get here. And then finally, we have a compressor. The compressor is really nice because what it does is sort of evens out your voice and makes it just a little bit louder and more present. So let's go ahead and give you a sample of that here. Right now it's turned off. Now I've turned it to the light setting so you can hear, you might have heard it just got a little bit louder. And what it does too, again, and a lot of people when they say the first word in a sentence tend to say the first part a little bit louder and then kind of get quieter as the sentence goes on. This will kind of even that out a little bit. Let's go to medium. Next up, we are in the medium setting on the compressor. And then finally, we are now on the heavy setting of the compressor. This is probably a little bit overdone for most situations, but it might work with your voice. Just go ahead and give it a try and see how it sounds. Now, one other thing with all of these settings, you can save them as presets. So if you want to just use the same settings every single time, you can kind of experiment with this, find what works best for your voice, save it as a preset, and then every time you open it up again, it's already there. Or if something gets muddled up, some of the settings get changed, you can go back to that preset and load it back up again. So it can be really nice and save you some time. Now, in our samples, we played this against the Shure SM7B, which is a more expensive microphone. That's a $400 microphone. This is about a $250 microphone. And there were a few things that I wanted to run through. One of the challenges with the SM7B is that it requires a ton of gain. It's a purely XLR microphone. You cannot plug it in via USB directly. So you need a preamplifier or an audio interface or something like that to connect it to your computer for recording or for using on remote calls. And the challenge with the SM7B is it requires fairly high-end gear, or it requires what are called microphone activators. They're essentially preamplifiers that add even more gain. That microphone, the SM7B, sounds legendary, sounds great, but it requires a ton of gain. So the main question many of you will have is, well, what about the MV7? Does it require as much gain? And the answer is no. In my tests, to get the same levels out of the MV7, we could use 6 dB less gain than the SM7B. Now, that may not sound like a lot, but a lot of times that's kind of like right on the edge of what most preamplifiers or audio interfaces can supply. So you're going to be in a much better space with the MV7, and there's a good chance that you will not need a cloudlifter or a FET or any of the other microphone activators out there for this to work with your audio interface. Build quality-wise, this microphone is just like all Shure microphones, high quality. This is going to last. It'll take a beating. The only thing I'd be worried about, I guess if you dropped it in the wrong way, maybe this feels like it's a little bit of plastic, the touch part, but I'm thinking it's protected pretty well. You'd have to really kind of slam it down on an uneven surface to really do any damage. But overall, I think they've done a really nice job. Now, there were a few cons with this microphone. We already talked about some of them, but let's kind of run through those again. First of all, the limiter wasn't as useful as I hoped it would be. It does appear to be a digital limiter, and it does allow some of that distortion to come through. So that, unfortunately, isn't going to help if you get really, really loud. Now, it's going to be hard to get loud enough to make this clip, so not a huge deal. Don't take that the wrong way. But it would be nice if it was an analog limiter and actually was able to prevent that distortion. I did find that this microphone's a little bit prone to what are called plosives. When you say the letters P or B, it has this kind of tendency to pop. Let me give you an example here. I'm going to be pretty close on the microphone. Peter Piper picked a peck of pickled peppers, or, if you would, please bring pizza pronto. Peter Piper picked a peck of pickled peppers. Peter Piper picked a peck of pickled peppers. Now, that's mostly going to be an issue when you're right up on the microphone. If you're back a little bit, not generally as much of a problem. What I found that was interesting, and this was actually, I think there was a YouTube channel called ProScan Audio, I think it's called, and they actually suggested that if you swap out the foam cover with a Shure cover that's actually made for the SM7B, you can actually prevent that problem. Let me show you what I mean. All right, this is the cover for the Shure SM7B. And now when I'm right up on it, please bring pizza pronto. Peter Piper picked a peck of pickled peppers. You can see that it manages that. Now, this is a longer foam cover, so it sticks out more, but it puts your mouth in the right position so you're not likely to get all of that plosive activity. So if you wanted to buy one of these aftermarket to prevent that problem, it fits great, I will say that. Or just make sure you stay back far enough, or if you want to, you can use a pop shield as well. Those are lots of those available for less than $25. This is probably a little bit nitpicky, but the touch surface was not quite as responsive as I'd hoped. Maybe it's just my fingers. Sometimes it didn't seem to totally register all the touches. Not a huge deal. Again, there's the app as well, so you have both options. If you're persistent and just kind of use a light touch, it works okay, but it would be nice for it to be a little bit more responsive. And then finally, there is the USB micro output. I was on a conference call where a representative from Shure was talking about that. They said the reason they used that was that all of the other microphones in the Shure Motive line use USB micro. So they wanted to be consistent for those that already own those microphones. I would really prefer if we had USB-C at this point. It'd be really nice to move on. USB micro is a pretty fragile connector. I wouldn't be as worried. Well, maybe I would be a little bit worried about the port getting damaged, but I have definitely damaged some USB micro cables in the past, especially the part on the cable, the connector on the cable. So it's not the most robust type of connector. USB-C seems a little bit stronger, and it would be nice to kind of get rid of USB micro once and for all. But that's a reality here. It works. It's fine. I've got USB micro cables. I've got probably 15 of them, so it's not a problem. And it comes with the USB micro cable, so you'll have everything you need. One other thing that's interesting with microphones is radio frequency interference. Let's see if we get any of that. So if I put my phone up close to this and I have a video running, let's go ahead and pull up. Okay, I've turned the volume all the way down. So we've got some 2.4 gigahertz radio frequency coming out of this phone. Not hearing any radio frequency interference. What if we make a phone call? I'm going to turn Wi-Fi off so that we kind of force it to use LTE in this case. Actually, let's just run another video. It's going to run that over LTE. That'll be easier. Okay, we're running a video with running it over LTE. Ooh, there's some. But you basically have to have it right up on the microphone. Everywhere else is just fine. So that's good news, actually. From my point of view, that seems really well RF shielded. Microphones are prone to picking that kind of stuff up, but in this case, it didn't pick it up unless I put the phone right on the front, which is something you don't typically do when you're using a microphone. Now, it does not have a shock mount. It comes with a sort of U yoke. And the question is, what happens if you're typing on your computer or if you bump the mic stand? Let's demonstrate that for you. And then typing on the computer. This is just an Apple keyboard here. And I'm using just an onstage stand's desk stand. If you use sort of a broadcast arm stand, I think you're going to get a little bit more separation generally, but the desk stands will transfer some of that energy from the desk. So if you're going to be doing a lot of typing, you might look into a broadcast stand, especially if you can attach it to something that's not directly attached to the desk. So for example, in my case, I've got a little table next to my desk and I have a boom arm attached to that. So that can kind of isolate the two so that when you are typing, it's not going to pick up as much of that noise. So overall, there is a look at the Shure MV7. From my point of view, it's a really great microphone. I think it's a really good choice for someone that has a budget of $250. It spends a lot of time online on the different types of calls or is doing podcasting, perhaps streaming, all of those types of things where you're working in a non-acoustically treated space where you want a little bit more separation. You don't want to pick up all the noise in your house while you're recording. So it works very nicely, great set of features. The app is super simple to use. It works great for people that don't know a lot about audio or for people that want to be able to tweak things a little bit more. And of course, There is also an XLR output. So if you do move into an audio interface, something a little bit more professional, you have the ability to do that. And then from there, you can use any sort of audio processing you might have available in the apps that you're using. So a lot of freedom there. Overall, I think it sounds pretty good. It's not quite the same as the SM7B. It doesn't have as much of that rich low end as the SM7B, but to me, it still sounds very good. And in fact, I think that's part of what Shure was trying to accomplish, is that the SM7B can sometimes sound a little woolly. That is to say, it can start to sound kind of woo, 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 because it has all this really rich low end energy. And I know a lot of people like hearing that. It sounds warm and cozy. But the reality is that that can sometimes be difficult to understand what somebody's saying if it's a little too much. And so what this does, this microphone seems to roll a little bit of that off, not pick up quite so much of that rich low end, but at the same time still enough that it sounds nice and rich and pleasant to hear. So there's my assessment of the MV7. Hope that was helpful. If you have any questions, go ahead and leave those down in the comments below. And if you've not already subscribed, make sure you do that. And we'll be sure to get you more great videos on how to improve your lighting and sound for video. Talk to you soon.